When will we see people come in? Here they are. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I see lots of people joining. We'll just wait a minute or so for everyone to join. In the meantime, you're very welcome to introduce yourself in the chat with your name, maybe where you're calling from, and maybe even your favorite local nature spot. So just to do that, you'll just need to click on all panelists and attendees so everyone can see your comment. So my name's Taryn. I'll do a proper introduction in a minute when everyone's here, but my favorite local nature spot is probably Yarra Bend Park in Melbourne. I really love going at dusk to see all the flying foxes wake up and fly off. It's really spectacular. Yeah, so if you just want to share in the chat your name, where you're calling from, and your favorite local nature spot, that would be awesome. And what about you, Basha? Where's your favorite local nature spot?
I'm not sure if it counts as local, but my favorite place is the Victorian Alps, which is where I just spent my weekend, which was beautiful.
Lovely. What did you do? Were you hiking?
I was hiking for 2 days at a place called the Bluff.
Lovely.
So yeah, it was great to be out there enjoying nature, especially after the year we had last year. Yeah,
I still haven't had a good break yet, properly immerse myself, so I'm looking forward to that. Joel, what about you? Where's your favorite local nature spot? Joel? I don't think we've got Joel right now. That's okay. So just waiting for everyone to join. I'll give it another minute or so. We've got almost 400 people on the call, which is really exciting. While we're waiting, we're just introducing ourselves. So in the chat, if you want to pop your name, where you're from, and your favorite local nature spot, so we can just share that with everyone, that would be amazing. You'll just need to click on all panelists and attendees so everyone can see your comment. Oh, Joel's back now. Joel, did you want to share your favorite local nature spot?
Yeah, hi Taryn, hi everyone. Sorry, my internet just dropped out, typical of the webinar, I would say. I also live in Melbourne, and I grew up in the northeastern suburbs just along the Yarra River, and there's a place along the Yarra called Laughing Waters, which is a beautiful bush reserve near Eltham, and that was one of the first places I went to after lockdown. All the birds down there and just the flowing water. It's very calming, and a place that means a lot to me from my childhood.
That's beautiful, Joel. Thank you. I think I'll get us started because it's 7:02 and we've got a lot to get through. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name's Taryn. I'll be your host for our discussion tonight. So basically, yes, we're here to talk about our National Environment Law. But before that, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm on today. That is the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people here with us on the webinar today. So if you know the traditional name of the land you're on, please feel free to share that in the chat. And as we talk about our national environment laws tonight, it's really important to remember that First Nations people have been managing this land for a very long time. And we should look to them for just their knowledge and expertise in caring for country. So Joel, I might get you to just take over for 1 second, as I just need to do something with my tech, if that's all right.
Absolutely. So hi, everyone. It's so nice to see you all tonight. Let me just catch up. So we're here to talk tonight about the once-in-a-decade review of our environmental law. So what it found and what it means for the future of environmental protection in Australia. To help us do that, we're of course joined by ACF's Nature Program Manager, Basha Stasak. and myself, Joel Marlan-Tribe. I'm ACF's Community and Mobilisation Coordinator. We also have Tom, Isabella and Taryn helping us out on the tech and triaging all of your comments and questions. So big thanks to all of them for joining us, and a huge thanks to every single one of you who is giving up your Tuesday night to come and have this really important discussion with us. In a moment, we'll hear from Basha about the review, but before that, we'd just like to take a moment to recognise the incredible work and support from so many people on this call tonight that has ultimately helped to get us, and by us, that's the state of our environmental politics in this country and the momentum that's being built to where we are now. So to our donors and members who make this work possible, to the people working on the ground in their local communities, we're all at a pivotal point in the conversation about nature protection in Australia, and that is thanks to you. Over the course of this campaign together, we've written thousands of letters to MPs and senators. We've shown up at rallies and community events, and we've got our hands dirty planting trees and really doing that on the ground work of making sure that precious habitat is there for our precious wildlife. And we've actually really shaped this review in a really important way. Many of you have shared your wisdom and experience through the consultation process. There were an incredible 30,000 submissions into the environmental law review that we're talking about tonight. And the report's strong recommendations, which Basha is about to talk us through in a moment, are in many parts as a result of the incredible work that people put into all of those submissions. So we just wanted to say thank you, keep it up. Every single action, big and small, including the biggest petition in ACF's history of over 400,000 signatures, it really adds up and gets us to where we are tonight. So let's keep going.
Hey, Joe, I'm all fixed up now. I'm so sorry to put you on the spot there.
That's all right.
I just had a bit of problem with my Zoom call. I can take over if you like, or do you want to keep going?
Go for it.
All right, I'm going to keep going. Thanks, everyone, for your patience. Well, thank you, Joel, for jumping in there to help while my computer wasn't working very well. We're just going to talk quickly about housekeeping. So we've actually got a full house tonight, 500 people on this call. That's really amazing, and I'm really excited to share the night with you. So please feel free to speak to each other using the chat function. You can click all panelists and attendees so everyone can see your comment. If you actually have questions for us, please use the dedicated Q&A function, which you should see on the bottom of your screen. So let's get stuck into it then. Basha, over to you. Can you tell us what this review is all about and why it's so important?
Of course. Well, so as most of you would probably know and not be surprised by, Australia has one of the world's worst rates of extinction. And this is obviously a massive problem, and it's getting much worse. And some of our most iconic species like the koala and the platypus are threatened. And the bushfires that we saw last summer really made that situation even worse. And so really our national environment laws are charged with protecting our natural environment. They're one of the key safeguards that we have in place. And so if they don't work, then we really can't reverse this extinction rate, which is impacting not just our species, but also many of our most precious ecosystems, of course, the Great Barrier Reef, the Murray-Darling, the Blue Mountains, which we saw 80% of burnt in the bushfires. And so what this review was about is that every decade, there has to be an independent review of our National Environment Act, the EPBC Act, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is quite a mouthful, so I'm going to keep calling it the EPBC Act. This is the second review of that act. And Professor Graham Samuel was put in charge of that review, and many of you may recall that back in July, he released an interim report, which was his first response to what he was seeing about the Act and what he was hearing from the community. And then he did a range of further consultations, and in October, he handed the federal government his final report. And that final report was released by the government last week. And so that's what we're here really to talk about today. And it is so critically important because if we can fix these laws, if we can turn it around, then we can really make a dent and really improve the protections for our species, for our ecosystems, and of course for communities.
Awesome. And Basha, I'm sure you're going to have a lot to say about this. What did the review say? What were the outcomes?
Yes, I'm going to have quite a bit to say about this. So overall, it's a really strong and comprehensive report from Professor Graham Samuel that really outlines the problem that Australia's natural world faces, the problem our species face, the problem our ecosystems face, and really says that the EPBC Act is outdated and it really needs fundamental reform. A really powerful line that he has in his report is he notes that the Act is actually facilitating this decline, and so it needs a complete overhaul. Also highlights that it's not working for the environment, it's not working for communities, it's not working for business, it's really not working for anyone. And he lays the challenge to the government that fundamental reform is required, and it's required urgently, or we're simply going to be locking in further species extinction, further ecosystem destruction, and that is completely unacceptable, to quote Professor Samuel. Now, it's a really comprehensive report, as I said, so I'm not going to go into all the different recommendations and all the different detail. I'll confess I haven't had a chance to read it cover to cover. But what I am going to do is I'll give you some of the key highlights in the report and some of our ACF's initial reflections, but it definitely needs more thought and more analysis into diving into the different areas. So I'll cover a few different areas. I'll kick off with national environmental standards. Some of you may recall, look, national environmental standards were a feature of Professor Samuel's interim report. They are really the central piece of what he is proposing. They are what everything would be measured against and what decisions would be ultimately made against. They need to be binding, they need to be enforceable, and they're a set of rules that would apply nationwide. Now, Professor Samuel's included in his in his final report, a set of draft standards. And while these aren't perfect, there's a couple of questions, there's a couple of gaps, they are a really important first step. And really, if we see these reforms that Professor Samuel has recommended to go forward, then getting the standards right is the absolutely critical first step, because as I said, it's what everything else revolves around. It's what sets the kind of test for everything, every decision the government will make in the future. So that's one bit. The independent regulator, this is something you probably have heard ACF going on and about and other groups going on and about. It's a real gap in our current environmental protection system. There isn't an independent regulator at the national level. Professor Samuel has sort of recommended two agencies or bodies. One is a National Assurance Commissioner, which is quite a mouthful, but which is basically this commissioner would be charged with auditing how the Act is performing and auditing how decisions are being made against the standards and are they being complied with. And the other is, if you will, a compliance and enforcement office, which would sit within the department but would be independent. And compliance and enforcement is something that really is a problem under the Act. We've seen it exposed over and over again that there isn't really enforcement being done to make sure that conditions by developers are being followed through. And so this is a really important recommendation. There's a lot to unpack about how these bodies would work and how effective they would be. But an important takeaway is that it is a significant step forward, what he's recommending, because at the moment we don't have any form of independent regulator under the Act. Climate change is no doubt going to be an area of interest for a lot of people in this call. So to quickly touch on that, Professor Samuel does seem to have changed his view a little bit when it comes to climate change from what he had to say in the interim report. In the interim report, he sort of suggested that climate change should be dealt with in other legislation by the government. Here, there are some recommendations around proponents or people that are sort of proposing projects that need to be assessed under the Environment Act would need to disclose the emissions of what they're proposing. and also that we need to deal much better with data and monitoring and modeling so that we know how the landscapes are changing in a warming world. So seeing a role to play there for climate change, I think we would like to have seen that go a bit further, but it's certainly better than what we currently have, which is an act that doesn't even mention the words climate change. The other ones I'll very quickly touch on, because I suspect there'll be areas of interest, is RFAs, or Regional Forest Agreement. This is something probably a lot of people aren't familiar with, but they're basically 20-year regional plans between states and the Commonwealth about how we manage some of our native forests. At the moment, under those RFAs, they are exempt from our national environment laws. And Professor Samuels recommended to get rid of that exemption, which is a pretty massive move. And the final thing to probably reflect on is states and territory approvals. So this is an issue that you would have heard a lot about. It's the one thing that the federal government took out of Professor Samuels' previous review. And it's this idea that at the moment, the Commonwealth makes environmental approvals if they impact things that are matters of environmental national significance. So things like World Heritage Sites, threatened species, things like that. And the proposal was to hand that over to states and territories to make those approvals. And Professor Samuels has continued to recommend that, but has noted that in order to make that happen, you first need to put the independent regulator in place. You first need to get the standards right. And there are a number of interconnected reforms that need to happen before we simply hand these over to states and territories. And that's a very important takeaway from the report, which we'll talk about a bit about later. So that's a few sort of key things that came out of the report, and I'm sure there'll be questions about other detail that I'm happy to answer. Overall, I think the key takeaway is that Professor Samuels is recommending a complete overhaul. He has a sort of 3-stage proposal, which ultimately results in a whole new act being put in place.
Wow, that was a lot of information. Thank you, Basha. I just remind people that if they do have a question for Basha or Joel or ACF in general, they can put it in the Q&A box and press submit. We'll do our best to get through as many as we can in the short amount of time that we have tonight. Basha, just a follow-on question from that. What's the government's response been so far to this review?
So the government's response has been quite sparse. We sort of got a media release from them when they released the report, which said that they were considering what Professor Samuel had recommended, that they kind of intended to continue to pursue this idea of handing over approvals, environmental approvals, to states and territories, which is a bill that they've currently got before Parliament, and that they would look at doing national environmental standards. And that was really all that the minister had to say at this point. So we know that in their response to the interim report, they previously ruled out the idea of an independent regulator. The minister didn't comment on that this time around. And so it's a very sparse response. They are seemingly considering it, but we haven't got a lot of detail, which does leave us with some opportunities.
Thanks, Basha. We're going to open up for questions in a bit, but before you do that, could you tell us a bit about ACF's strategy from here and what people can do to get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really important to bring this back to what we really need to achieve, which is that we really need laws in this country that actually protect nature, and we need an independent regulator to enforce them. And that's really the goal that we're striving towards. And what Professor Samuel has done with review is really strengthened that argument and provided a lot of evidence about why that's needed, and also a pathway forward for how the government could do it. And now the ball is in the government's court about what they do, but it's also in our court in how we pressure the government to take up some of these critical reforms, because I think we all know that governments don't act without pressure. And so there's really 5 things that we need to do. The first and most important is we really need to make sure that the government is aware of this review, and this includes all the backbench members of parliament that might be in your electorates, really making sure that they've heard about the review, that they've looked at the review, and that we've sort of told them about the key findings that the government needs to act on. and that they're feeling pressure from the community that we want action, that we want to see the government act on this and not simply put it on the shelf and ignore it and move on. The other important step number 2, if you will, is, as you all know, the government currently has a bill before Parliament to hand over environmental approvals to states and territories. This bill hasn't yet passed the Senate, and we need to make sure that it doesn't pass, certainly before all of these other reforms that Professor Samuel has recommended are in place, the standards, the regulator. And that means we really need to be talking to the Senate crossbench, Rex Patrick in South Australia, Jackie Lambie in Tasmania, and Sterling Griff in South Australia, and also to the federal opposition, the ALP, and the Greens, of course, and making sure that they're aware that that bill cannot pass because the government just needs one vote to pass it. And really, it's one of the strongest leverage points we have to get the government to introduce some of these other reforms that are being proposed to fix our environment laws. So that's step number 2. Step number 3 is to continue to elevate the extinction crisis and this report. We know an incredible amount of Australians care about our natural world, but we need them to be talking to their members of parliament as well. We need the government, the ALP, the Greens, and the crossbench to be hearing from as many people as possible across Australia who are saying, I am concerned, I want to see action on this, and I want to see it urgently. And so we need to keep elevating the story and getting it out there. And we've seen some really great success over the last few days with that, with a number of people writing some pretty fantastic letters to the editor, to newspapers across the country about the review and what was required. So we need to keep that up. And then the final 2 steps are to do with talking to state and territory governments, because they are a critical player here. The government wants to give them the approval powers, lay the whole problem at their sort of feet and wash their hands of it, if you will. And so it's important to talk to state and territory governments and explain that actually what's required is action at the federal level, and they shouldn't just be going along with what the federal government wants. And also talking to business, which I know can often seem like a bit of a hopeless lost cause, but in this particular case, we have seen some good progress, particularly from the Business Council, who ACF and other groups have been engaging with, who put out quite a good media release in response to the review, recognising that, yes, we do need an independent regulator. Yes, we do need national standards. So business is a critical player here. Some of the businesses like Rio Tinto, we know, have been lobbying quite hard to weaken our environment laws. And so we need to try and push them to actually take on board some of these recommendations. So those are the sort of 5 things, I know it's on a short list, that we really need to do over the next, or ACF and everyone else is going to be doing over the next few months.
Awesome. Thanks, Basha. It's always good to hear of like all the ways that we can get involved, and there are often so many. So thanks for talking a bit about those. I know that there's lots and lots of questions coming through the chat. We've got Teryn here to ask some of them. Teryn, what have we got?
Hello, thank you, Taryn. Thank you, Basha. We have about 50 or more questions coming through the chat, so I'm frantically trying to have a bit of a look through and see if there's some common ones so we can ask the one that most people are asking. One of them is from Craig, who asks, how do councils fit into all of these regulations?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So at the moment, councils do have obviously certain environmental responsibilities at the local level, while the federal government really deals with, as I said, what are called the matters for national environmental significance, so World Heritage, Ramsar, listed threatened species, those sort of things. They obviously intersect. Things that councils can make a decision on in certain ways, the Commonwealth may also be making a decision on. But they're systems that sort of work side by side rather than sort of operating together. There's been some suggestion that in the same way that the Commonwealth could hand over approval powers to states and territories, it could potentially do that and give it to a local council. That seems like a massive, massive leap, because if state and territory governments are not well resourced to do that, you can't imagine local councils being well placed. And they certainly couldn't kind of consider the national impacts or the state impacts of a decision. So they operate sort of as separate systems that sort of overlap, if you will, at the moment.
Fabulous, thank you. We've got a couple other ones coming through. So one is from Kirsten, who notes that no longer exempting the RFA seems like a huge and really exciting change. Would that recommendation impact some regions or species more than others?
Yeah, it's a massive change. The exemption given to regional forests agreement, this idea of allowing basically logging and exempt in native forests, in certain native forests, and exempting it from national environment laws, has been a long-standing issue. And so to have Professor Samuel turn around and say it's not working, it's a terrible system, and get rid of it, get rid of the exemption is a huge step. It would have certainly greater impacts on certain species. Obviously, those species that reside forests that are currently being logged. Victoria, where I'm based, the leadbeater possum species that I would benefit probably from that decision, depending on it was implemented and where. And then it would also impact different regions in different ways. So those areas with native forest logging would be the ones that would be impacted. And it's a really important step, because it's not saying end all form of logging. What it's saying is that the same rules need to apply to the logging industry as apply to every other industry.
Thanks, Basha. We've got a couple of people asking about the 5-step plan. So these are all the things that we need to do next. And people are keen to get involved in it, of course. Where can people find the 5 steps and some information about how to put them into action?
Yes, that's an excellent question. So we are going to talk about one of the steps a little bit later, or Joel is going to talk about one of the steps a little bit later. So hold out for that. And then we'll be putting out all this information in the email post the webinar. And we will, don't worry, we're not going to be asking you to do all 5 things at once. We'll be staging it. So really those first 3 steps I talk about around elevating the report and the extinction crisis, which some people have already taken action on through the letters to the editor, is something we'll be doing straight away and kind of ongoingly. And then we'll also be sort of about how you email your member of parliament, be they the coalition, the Greens, the ALP, or one of the crossbenchers. That'll be a critical next step. That will come through in a supporter email that'll come to you after this webinar.
Great. Taryn, do we have time for a couple more?
You do. We've got at least 10 minutes more for questions, if there's that many right now. Maybe ask a couple, and then we can move on and have some more time for questions later. Beautiful,
thank you. Okay, so Kalopi asks, how likely is the government to actually accept these recommendations and act on them?
Yeah, it's the $1 million question, isn't it? And it's look, at the end of the day, it really comes down to how much pressure they come under from us, from other groups, from the rest of the community. And it's really the role here is to really keep pushing and make sure that your MP, your senator is hearing about this, and they're hearing from as many people in the community as possible. As I mentioned, nature is something that most Australians love. We know that, but it's not something that MPs actually hear a lot about. And that really needs to change if we want to see ambitious action from governments on nature protection. It can often feel sort of hopeless, but I kind of like to remind people that the current act, the EPBC Act that was just reviewed, was introduced by the Howard government. And while it has obviously huge problems right now, it was a pretty massive step when it was introduced over 20 years ago. So we know that governments, including coalition governments, can actually introduce some pretty groundbreaking environmental legislation and have done so in the past. So it's possible. It's not easy and it's not quick. And these things take years, but I think we've got a really important step here in this independent review, and now we need to really push the government to take it the next step.
Great. I've probably got time for 2 more, I think, and then we'll hand over to the next part. So one from Marilyn is about trying to put the context of these recommendations into live campaigns. So thinking about like the Franklin River campaign and maybe the Adani mine, like how would these recommendations interact with those 2 cases?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Marianne. And I think when we think about our national environment laws and the EPBC Act, and it's probably something I could have mentioned in the intro, it really interacts with so many different things. So the Adani coal mine, the Toondah Harbour development, of course, the Franklin, which is where the EPBC Act was in fact sort of born in many ways. It interacts with all of those. So the stronger the Act is, the Act sort of governs all of those decisions. It's the process and the rules by which the government decides whether or not to approve a project to go ahead, be it a mine or a dam, or whatever it may be, land clearing. That's, you know, EPBC Act is what the government uses to make that decision. So the stronger the Act, the stronger the standards in the Act, the stronger the processes in the Act, the stronger the kind of independent decision making and the community's participation in that, the better place we are to actually protect our environment and ensure that these developments, you know, don't send species on the road to extinction, don't destroy critical ecosystems, and are the best decisions for our communities, who of course we all rely on a healthy environment as well. So if you can strengthen the Act or fix the Act, then you can really impact every single one of those decisions, because it governs the rules by which all these developments ultimately have to play by. And there's a whole raft of recommendations that will have that impact. Sort of highlight the standards and the independent regulator, because I see those two probably will impact everything. But even Professor Samuel's recommendations around, you know, how the climate change might enter into the Act, because as I said, it currently isn't even mentioned, or how regional forest agreements are treated, they're all going to have a massive impact.
Great, thank you, Basha. And maybe one more for now, and then we'll come back to questions after. So Mark asks, do we know who's lobbying actively against these recommendations in the report at the moment?
So we don't. The review just came out. So I think everyone is still sort of scrambling to understand it and exactly what's been recommended. We've certainly seen parts of the logging industry, unsurprisingly, very quickly jump on this idea of exempting RFAs and go, oh no, the system works fine, that doesn't need to happen. And we certainly know that Rio Tinto lobbied very hard a few months ago, or more than a few months ago, so it was 2019 that they kicked it off, for handing over approval decisions to states and territories. So we know that these are two players that definitely have been involved. I think there will no doubt be others, and it will be key for us to kind of, you know, counter that with a rise in community pressure and community sentiment saying, no, we do want to see these laws strengthened and these reforms implemented.
Thanks, Basha. Well, thanks everyone for your great questions, and Basha for answering them, and also Taryn for asking them. Cool. So we've heard a little bit from Basha about, you know, some of the things that we can do to really champion the recommendations from the review. We're going to dig a little bit deeper into one of those now. So we're going to hear from ACS Community and Mobilisation Manager Joel Marlan-Tribe on how to write a really impactful letter to our elected representatives. Joel, did you want to tell us all about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So hi, everyone. It's always so awesome coming onto these events and seeing we've got 500 people here out there talking tonight about this stuff. And I just want to say how much of a privilege it is to be here with you all tonight talking about these really important issues. And what we're going to do is talk a little bit about this moment and how important it is for our elected representatives, regardless of where they sit on the political spectrum, to hear from everyday people like us, people on the ground doing really important work, or people who are sitting in your lounge rooms thinking, I really want to step up and do something about this. Now is the time for all our elected representatives to hear from us about this really important issue, because as Basha said, this is a once in a decade review, and the decisions that are made by our government and by all of our elected representatives at the moment will inform how our environment is protected or not in the years to come. So whether you've written to your local MP before about this issue, or whether it's your very first time, now it's a really great opportunity to let them know where you stand, share a bit about yourself and what you'd like them to do in response to the findings of this report. So we've got a couple of tips for you that we're about to share. Now, just so you know, of course, MPs do get a lot of correspondence, but it's actually quite easy to get their attention if you're a constituent in their local electorate. So there are all sorts of kind of statistics that people throw around about what kind of impact one email can have in the eyes of a local MP. I've heard kind of statistics that one email or one phone call to an MP says that about maybe 100 people in the community are feeling a similar way. Now, there are things that you can do, which we're about to talk about, that will make that impact felt even more deeply. So firstly, the tips are, like, tell them about who you are and why you care. So it's really important to remember that MPs are elected by a local community. So it's in their interest to take interest in who is writing to them about what, and to learn a little bit more about the people who are writing to them. So are you a parent? Are you a member of a local group or a club? What kind of jobs have you done? So just include 1 or 2 simple facts about yourself. And what this does is it helps your MP see where you fit in the community. And then that might lead them to think that other people like yourself are feeling similarly about the issue that you're writing about. So if you're writing to them for the first time, please tell them that as well, because they really take notice of the issues that inspire people to get in touch with them for the very first time, or for the first time in a long time. It's also really important to share a simple but honest and authentic reason about why you care so much about this issue. And I think when it comes to protecting the environment at any time, but even, you know, after the year we had last year, where so many of us were confined to a small space and really kind of taking in the local surrounds, connecting with something that's simple and authentic. And they're your local MP. They're going to know your area too, and relate to some of the places that you might really cherish in your local community. You also might want to pick a quote or two from the report that you'd like your MP to know about. And this is really kind of a link into this next tip, which is being clear about what you want them to do and why. So obviously this is a really big, complex report, but the reality is that what we're talking about is really simple. It's about the way that we treat our environment and the way that we set our planet up for future generations to come. So have a bit of a look through that report if that's something that interests you. But if that's a bit overwhelming as well, it's all good. We've got some brief asks that you're welcome to share with your MP in your email. So just having something clear for them to do is really important. So in this case, it's about advocating for stronger laws that protect nature and advocating for an independent regulator to enforce them. So regardless of whether your MP is in government right now, or if they're in opposition, or if they're an independent or a minor party member, there's something that every MP can do to be advocating within their party, speaking in Parliament for these really important issues of stronger nature laws and an independent regulator to enforce them. You could do a little bit of research about your local MP to get a sense of them personally, maybe even just going through their social media pages and seeing if there are particular issues that they're really outspoken about, or if there's a particular local place that you've seen them advocating for, and maybe you might like to link that to the importance of these national laws when it comes down to protecting places at a local level. And just make sure when you're sharing that ask, you explain why you want them to do that ask. So it's one thing to ask them what to do. It's really compelling to tell them why you want them to do that, because that's where those values that connect us all, you know, we're all human beings behind it all and behind the screen. So really make sure you're authentic and real about why you care. The next tip is, of course, be concise, clear and polite. You're welcome to write a big long essay to your local MP, but it's not required. And in fact, you're probably more likely to get a swift response if you just think really carefully about how you're structuring your email and kind of water it down to the really important elements. So it doesn't have to be a long email. 3 to 5 paragraphs is kind of ideal. That's enough to introduce yourself, get your point across, ask your MP what you'd like them to do, and then talk about how you'd like them to follow up. Make sure you're polite, of course. So semi-formal kind of tone and respectful language is really important. Remember, you want to build an ongoing relationship with this MP, whether or not it's just via email. You might end up seeing them in the street one day and going, hey, I emailed you about this really important issue. You might remember that. Or you might even end up wanting to meet with them, or perhaps you've already met with them and have that relationship established. So just make sure that you're constructive in your approach, regardless of maybe what your research might uncover about their stance on some issues. And finally, just be patient and follow up. MPs, of course, do get a lot of correspondence, but as I mentioned earlier, it's actually quite easy to get their attention if you're a constituent in their local electorate. So do make sure that you name even just the suburb where you live. And if you don't hear from them after maybe 2 or 3 weeks, do be sure to follow up, because they are, of course, elected to represent all of us. They have an obligation to have that correspondence with their constituents. So yeah, this is such an important part of the democratic process, and a really powerful way that right now you can elevate these issues at a national level and make sure that all of our MPs are advocating for stronger laws and that independent regulator to enforce them. Finally, and this is just a bit of a recap, but also just giving you some ideas of structure about how you'd like maybe to shape your email. So step 1, as I said, introducing yourself, the issue that you're raising, why you care about it, and throw in there just where you're living as well, just so that they know that you're in their local constituency. Step 2 is to concisely explain the issue and your ask. So what you want the MP to do and why. And what we're about to do is, and if it's not in there already, is Tom will share some links to a landing page on our website, which makes it really easy for you to write an email to your MP. And we've got a couple of asks there you're welcome to copy and paste. Step 3, to wrap up, thank them for their time and provide your contact details and how you'd like them to follow up. So you're welcome to ask them to give you a phone call or to reply to your email if that's something that you'd like to do, if you'd like to speak to them more at length about what you've written to them. So that kind of takes us to now talking a little bit about it's a really important time to all be reaching out to our local MPs. It's even more important to be demonstrating community power in a really deep way. So as individuals, we can all do our bit to contribute to the national push. And I just want to talk a little bit about the ACF community groups. And there are over 40 ACF groups all around the country. These are groups of local volunteers, and they're hubs for people who want to connect locally with others who care about these issues and work together to learn new skills and run local campaigns to protect nature, engage with media, local stakeholders and decision makers. Some of the things that groups do, they get new faces in front of the MP. So MPs can see that there is a growing movement of people speaking up for nature and climate, and that it's not just the usual suspects who are contacting them and wanting to talk to them about these issues, that these issues impact all of us, and all of us have a stake in making sure that future generations have a healthy planet to live on. We also, in community groups, talk to local businesses in the local area and talk to them about how they can reduce their emissions and how they can use their voice as a local business to contribute to the push for greater ambition on nature and climate. Groups also run local stalls to get the word out, bring new people into our movement and signing petitions, having conversations in the local community. And they also run local activities like tree planting so that you can really get your hands dirty and contribute to local efforts in conservation in your area. And each ACF community group is connected to our national network. So every month there's a monthly webinar that you can join and be connected to all the people around the country doing all sorts of things that all add up to a really powerful people-powered movement. So together we can have national impact. Tom has added a link in the chat there for you, and we'll include that in the follow-up email as well about how you can see if there's a local group near you. And yeah, it's a fantastic way to get involved, meet some great people locally if you're not already there. And just a big shout out to all of the people on the call who are part of ACF community groups and the incredible work that you've been doing in the lead up to this really critical moment. And as Basha mentioned earlier, so much of what we're looking at now is because of people like yourselves who have been stepping up and really dedicated for such a long time. And that's, of course, people in ACF groups, people in all sorts of groups all around the country that have been doing this work for decades to get us to where we are. Back to you, Taryn.
Thanks, Joel. That was so wonderful and full of energy. We're actually running ahead of time, so we've got heaps of time for questions, and I know there've been heaps more coming through. So I will pass over to Taryn. Taryn, what do we have? What questions do we have?
We have quite a few. So Reggie asks, is the Conservation Act and law currently still in place? And if so, why are people able to cut down natural koala habitat?
Yes, that is an excellent question, Reggie. So yes, the current act is in place, and the fact that you are able to cut down koala habitat, critical koala habitat, is part of the problems that the review sort of points to as why the law isn't working. So what this review is really all about is exposing the holes and the problems, and then trying to outline a way that you can plug those holes, if you will, and strengthen the act so that it does actually protect critical koala habitat or platypus habitat or whatever species you may want to choose. So it can't just be cut down or whenever. And so that's why we really need to push to fix it.
Great, thank you. Lindsay asks, what partnerships has ACF with other groups to have coordinating campaign actions on this issue?
So ACF works with something or an alliance called the Places You Love Alliance, which is an alliance of a number of Australian environment groups, including WWF, BirdLife, the Humane Society, the Wilderness Society. I'm sure I've forgotten someone, which is a bit embarrassing, but a number of groups. It also has a much smaller group members of the conservation councils across Australia, a number of local wildlife groups. And really this alliance is working together around strengthening our environment laws.
Great, thank you. David asks, how do we overcome bipartisan resistance to tackling climate and environmental issues? Only the easy ones for you tonight, Basha.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Taryn. I mean, I think it's one of those million-dollar questions, isn't it? That I think we all ask ourselves daily, to be honest, about how do you overcome that resistance. I think there's a number of things we need to do, and I think, you know, both nature destruction and climate change are incredibly important issues, and they're obviously incredibly interlinked. But I do want to separate them out very briefly and say, when it comes to nature, we have a little bit less polarization politically on the issue. It is something that tends to cross political boundaries in a way that, unfortunately, at the moment, we're not seeing with climate change. So whether you're conservative, progressive, or whatever it is, nature is something that tends to bind us all together, and that's something we see in sort of polls done, and even when you speak with politicians, and we've seen in Australian political history. As I mentioned, it was the Howard government, who was a highly conservative government, that introduced the Current Environment Act. So it is something that can resonate with politicians of all stripes and communities of all stripes. But we really need to talk to them about the fact that nature in Australia is in trouble and does need help, and that we have things that we can do, one of which is overhauling our national environment laws. So I think it's a difficult thing. How do you overcome bipartisan resistance? And one of them is about how we talk about the issue and trying to connect with as many different people as we can, including politicians from all different parties. And the other is really finding ways to make it local. You know, we all have nature in our backyards that we love. Some of us may have projects or developments that are being proposed, and I'm thinking here particularly of Toondah Harbour in Queensland and Moreton Bay, which has seen a very, very active campaign in that community to stop an apartment complex from being built in a internationally protected wetland. And so really localizing it for people and localizing the threats that nature may be experiencing, but also the opportunities that, you know, protecting nature, restoring nature in our backyards can really make a massive difference.
There's two questions here about the independent regulator, so I might ask them at the same time. One is from John, who asks who appoints the independent regulator, and then one is from Rosalind, which is what sort of powers are recommended for the regulator?
Yes, so it's a great question. In the review, Professor Samuels recommends sort of two quasi-regulators, a commissioner, which would be charged with basically looking at whether the national standards that are proposed are being complied with, and a compliance and enforcement office, which would be ensuring compliance under the Act, which is something that's not been working so far. So, you know, when an approval is given, there is a set of conditions that are applied, and someone needs to be checking whether or not those conditions are being followed through. And what we have found over the last 2 decades, the Act has been operating, is that that hasn't been happening, and there hasn't really been enforcement of those conditions, which is obviously a massive problem. And so those are the 2 bodies proposed and their powers. The commissioner is quite important because, as I said, the national environmental standards are sort of the linchpin. And so it's that everything is being measured against. So we need someone independent, which is what this commissioner is proposed to be really looking at, well, are we fulfilling and living up to those standards? Are decisions being made in line with those standards? And the important step here is that they're taking that out of the role of the minister, who at the moment is almost to some extent all powerful under the EPBC Act. They have a lot of discretion to make approvals and sort of judge whether things are being followed through. So those are the powers. Who appoints them? Well, the government would appoint them. It's important to note the commissioner would report to Parliament. And so there is a way there of ensuring some level of transparency, that they're not simply just reporting to the government, and if the government doesn't like what they have to say, they can just ignore it. Now, these 2 bodies, I think there's a lot to unpack about how well they'd work. You know, we really wanted to see a kind of EPA at the national level, a much more powerful independent body. But this is still what Professor Samuel's recommending is still a really important sort of step forward, because at the moment there is no real independent regulator or decision making under the Act. It all sort of sits with the minister at the end of the day.
Great, thank you, Basha. We're still good to go for a couple more? Okay, great.
Yeah, we have quite a few more minutes. We'll pretty much go towards the end, Taryn. I'm wondering if there's any questions for Joel, or that might be good for Joel.
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Okay, this might be good for you, Joel. So the guy asks, given the independence of the crossbench in rejecting the premature laws that came through last year, what is the strategy for all of us in lobbying these individual senators?
That is an excellent question that I feel Basha is much more qualified.
Okay.
I'm sorry to put you on the spot, Joel.
Sorry, Joel.
I'll add anything if you don't cover it, Basha, eh?
I'm going to need you to re-ask the question, because I thought that Joel was going to answer it, Taryn.
Okay, great. So it's about the crossbench senators. Like, how are we putting pressure on them, given the important role that they have to play?
Yes, so there's a couple of different ways. Now, obviously, this is going to apply if you live in the states of South Australia and Tasmania. When it comes to the 3 crossbench senators, that's their home states, 2 in South Australia, 1 in Tassie, and they are very much mostly concerned with hearing from people from their own state who they represent. So there's a couple of different ways that we're putting pressure on them, and it should be recognised they've really held the line so far. So in all of our communications with them and any communications that anyone else has, I think the first step is to actually thank them for what they've done so far, because the government put this bill on the table back in August, and the senators really have been unwilling to vote for it and pushed it to a Senate inquiry so the Senate could have a proper look at it, and then wrote a report and said, we want to see the rest of the report. We want to see the final report from Graham Samuel. We want to see the government's response to it. We don't want to just tick off on this legislation without considering all the information, and that's what senators should do, and it was a really good step, and it came from the fact that they did hear from constituents who raised concerns. So they've done well so far, and I want to basically see them keep that up and say, well, now you've got the review, and the review says you've got a bunch of interconnected reforms here, and you now need to tell the government that they need to do these things before you pass the legislation. So writing to them, obviously, is step one. You can send them an email. You can give their office a call. Arranging a meeting is also a really powerful thing. And again, bringing it to local issues. So the Murray-Darling is a particularly important example for South Australians, where if the government passes the bill with none of the safeguards and none of the other reforms that Professor Samuels is recommending, then basically what can happen is Queensland and New South Wales can approve dams on the Murray that are going to ultimately impact how much water South Australia has, but South Australia doesn't get a say. And so, you know, bringing in the local issues, whether it be something like the Murray-Darling or a species that you're particularly cared about that's found in South Australia or that's found in Tasmania, but trying to connect with them ultimately on local issues through writing to them, giving them a call, asking for you to meet with them, and also talking to other people in your community who are concerned about this and getting them to do the same. One of the important things with particularly Rex Patrick and Jackie Lambie, who are independents, they are just on their own, is they really want to connect with as many people as they possibly can in their communities, because they don't have the backing of the big parties. They don't have the funding of the big parties, you know, advertising and budgets. And so really the way that they get their name out there, that the way that they ultimately get elected is through engaging with the community around them. And so they are very receptive to talking to their constituents. And the same is true with Sterling Griff, who's a member of Central Alliance, which is quite a small party of two. And so engaging with all of them at that local level and telling them you are a constituent, this is why you're concerned about what it would mean for South Australia or for Tasmania, is a really important first step.
Great, thank you, Basha. And a follow-up question is, you mentioned that mostly this is kind of a task for people in Tasmania and SA. There's been a couple of questions that have come through about people asking whether they should just be looking to contact their local MP, or whether they should be trying to contact a few other people as well. I think Basha or Joel, you'll probably have useful perspectives on this.
So everyone always forgets about their senators. And so yes, talk to your local MP, but your senators for your state represent you too. So definitely as a step, feel free to get in touch with your senators. You will all have certainly coalition and ALP senators for each state, and potentially some Greens, potentially some independents, depending on your state. And as we've talked about the crossbench a lot, but the ALP is just as important in this case when it comes to passing that bill. As I said, it only needs one vote, and that vote could come from, you know, the Labor Party. And so, or the Greens, but I doubt it would be the Greens, but it's still good to engage with them. And so it's good to, yeah, definitely talk to your senators, not just your member of parliament, but your member of parliament is a good place to start.
So we've probably got time for just one more, Taryn, one more question.
Okay, Jude asks, what's the time scale for the government to react to the Samuels report? Like, when do they need to respond to it and decide if they're going to implement the recommendations?
That's a good question. And there isn't really a time scale. You know, they can take as long as they want at the end of the day. And I think it's the pressure they're under as to how quickly they'll respond. The one thing that is, I guess, putting them under pressure is that they do want this bill that they've got to hand over approval powers to states and territories to pass. And if they can't convince the crossbench or the ALP or the Greens to pass it under current conditions, then that might force them to announce some reforms in order to convince one of those groups, one of those crossbenchers to vote for it. So that's a real leverage point, if you will. But there isn't really a timeline. The other thing it sort of rounds back into the other question as well, Taryn, that I forgot to mention is we've talked a lot about, you know, it's really important to talk to your MPs, to your senators, but I don't want to lose the thread that it's really also important to raise the profile of the extinction issue, the extinction crisis, and the need to fix our laws, and, you know, what the report has said, because one of the things we need to do is make sure that politicians are hearing and seeing this as in many places and from as many people as possible. So whether it's writing a letter to the editor, getting onto a community radio show, you know, just talking to your friends and family and getting them to make a call to their local members of parliament office, whatever you can do, all of those things are really, really important, because the more MPs hear about it, the more they see it, the more likely it is that we will actually succeed.
Great, thank you so much, Basha. There's a few more questions, and we're going to do the best we can to answer some of them in the chat. And if not, please get in touch with us and we'll be able to make sure that you get all the information that you need. Thanks so much.
Yes, thanks, Taryn. And thank you so much, Basha and Joel, for sharing all of your knowledge and wisdom tonight and answering all of our questions. It's been really awesome. To everyone on the call, thank you again for joining us. It was really amazing to be joined by so many other people who want nature in Australia to be properly protected. You will be hearing a lot more about this campaign. If you're not subscribed to our email list already, make sure you're on there or follow us on social media to just stay up to date with all the latest kind of news and activities. In the meantime, let's all use this moment right now to push our leaders to actually make laws that protect nature. And Tom is going to share a link to our handy email tool in the chat for you to do that. You can also find it on the homepage of our website, so www.acforg.au. Now, I know that there was a few requests for kind of summary of all the things that we can do right now. We'll include that in a follow-up email to you. So again, make sure you subscribe to us. And that's all for tonight. So good luck with your writing. We really hope to see you again soon. And thank you all again for your passion and persistence. See ya.